Righto, you nines. We've been covering the stories of Chinese migrants in Australia in the colonial period pretty extensively, but it's time to have a look at some other non-European immigration experiences. You will be asked about this in the test. You don't need to be able to recall every single dot point in this presentation, but pressing pause right now and grabbing a pen and paper and taking notes is a really good idea, because the act of taking notes will help you recall this stuff in your brain. So I'm encouraging you all to do that right now. Hit pause, grab out a notebook, and just take notes on stuff, on basic notes on what you see on your screen. So do that now. Did you do it? Good, awesome. Let's continue. So first off is Afghans. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with street art, but you might notice some of these posters by Peter Drew. Did some really cool posters, I think about a year or two ago now, emphasizing the fact that Aussies don't all have pale skin and wear blue singlets and eat sausages that they've burnt on a barbecue. Australia is interesting and diverse. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. Some of the people that are depicted in these Aussie photos are Afghans, or what would be called Afghans, because I've got the inverted commas here, especially these two guys, and I'll tell you why there's inverted commas around the word Afghans. From the 1830s, people came from many parts of British-controlled India and the Middle East to work as cameleers, which are camel drivers, right? Though they came from different places, they were still mostly referred to as quote-unquote Afghans. Even though they weren't all from Afghanistan, some of them were. Some were from India, Pakistan, places like Tajikistan, every now and again, Persia. But they came to all be referred to as Afghans, okay? Just to make things simple. So they transported goods and people across the desert before railways were built, right? Because remember, Central Australia is really dry. It was even dry back then because you didn't have things like plumbing and boreholes that had been sunk so often. So you had to transport stuff using horses and donkeys. But horses and donkeys need a lot of water. So camels were really good in this situation. And so people who could work with camels, particularly people from these countries, were really handy to have. So they were vital for the early development of these areas. And in fact, Australia today has one of the last big populations of wild camels, basically because once they weren't used anymore, they were kind of just let go, and they survived pretty well. All right. So, this, like I said, this work made them vital for the development of inland Australia, especially in the 1860s until 1900, when the railways were expanded at that point, and they weren't quite needed as much. You might have heard of the big railway called the Ghan. That's named after the Afghan cameleers. Now, the building of both the railways but also the overland telegraph line depended on these people and their skills, okay? So there was a telegraph line that went right up the guts of Australia from, I believe it would have been Adelaide all the way through to Darwin. But for that to be built, these guys were absolutely necessary. All right, that's a weird picture that you might not have seen, a camel being unloaded from a ship. Circa 1890s, this is in Port Augusta. All right, so many worked on short-term contracts, which required them to leave Australia after their contracts were up after a few years. But still, by 1900, there were around 2,000 living here permanently. They did face hostility, even though they were vital for the running of the country, because they looked different, and also they had a different religion. Many of them were Muslim. In fact, the first mosque in Australia, I believe, was built around 1860. So often they had to live in a separate part of these rural outback towns. The White Australia policy did consider them to be Asian, and so they couldn't become Australian citizens. After Federation, the Immigration Restricted Act prevented them from returning if they ever left the country. So if they went home to visit relatives, they couldn't come back, but at the same time they couldn't, become Australian citizens here. So they're kind of stuck in between two lands. The next group of people we're going to have a look at are the South Pacific Islanders. So this deals with people coming from places like New Caledonia or Vanuatu. All right, so from the 1860s, Queensland's sugarcane industry grew rapidly. Growing and harvesting sugarcane is hard. It takes back-breaking work. It's not easy. It was all physical back then as well. There was no combine harvesters. Everything was done by hand. But at the time, it was falsely, but commonly believed that it was unhealthy for Europeans to carry out physical labour in tropical areas. So what did people do? They looked for workers from places that are already tropical and close to Queensland. So South Pacific, so Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Kiribati, Tuvalu, primarily places like Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, though. These workers are sometimes called Kanakas, but this word is sometimes considered to be derogatory. So I'm just letting you know that, because if in your own research you might see that word. We're not going to use it, though, because South Pacific Islanders works fine. But that word Kanaka is based on the Hawaiian word for man. Often these people were kidnapped, actually, or tricked into getting the ship headed to Australia, and then they were forced to work for a specified amount of time, right? So they would either be, physically forced onto a ship, or sometimes they'd be tricked. So you'd say, okay, I'll give you a job if you come to Australia for a year and work for me. Which one would you like? You can have this coin money or this paper money. And not being used to that sort of thing, they might look at coins and see the metal and go, that's worth something. And they'll say, I'll take that. And then only later find out that it's not worth much because it was coins rather than notes. It was pretty awful practice. You might see the word blackbirding, which was the practice of either tricking or outright kidnapping people from the Pacific Islands and taking them to work under contract on Australian sugarcane farms. And once they got here, there wasn't really much choice. They could either work for the person or starve. So here we see a photo of South Sea Islanders, South Pacific Islanders, sorry, in front of their own mission hall. Okay, and so some of them were actually employed legitimately. You do need to remember that these practices varied from place to place and from employer to employer as well. Some people treated them reasonably fairly. Others had to work in horrible conditions that were very similar to slavery. Okay, they might not actually be slavery in the strictest terms, but I don't think that really matters that much. They didn't have much choice in whether they worked or not. They were treated awfully and they weren't paid enough. Many employers saw South Pacific Islanders as cheap workers who were easy to take advantage of, so they didn't really understand Australian culture at the time. They were often, shunned by other Australians, and they were less likely to unionise, so they were easy to take advantage of. In the 1890s, the death rate among South Sea Islanders in Queensland was over 60 for every 1,000 workers. All right, so for every 1,000 workers, 60 of them would die. I assume that means per year. While the death rate for other Queenslanders, was only 13. So 13 versus 60, it's a pretty big difference. So obviously they're either working in really dangerous conditions or there's other factors leading to that death rate. So that maybe they're not paid as well, they're not given as decent accommodation. Something's happening to their well-being, their human well-being, that's making them die more than other Queenslanders. And as part of the White Australia policy, after they've gone through all this, in 1901, the Pacific Islander Labour Act, because remember, the White Australia policy was a policy, okay? It's an idea that inspires different laws to be made. So there's the Immigration Restriction Act, which was a big one in 1901. The other one is the Pacific Islander Labour Act, which is specific to these people, meant that these guys had to be gradually deported. Okay, they weren't all kicked out at once, but thousands of Pacific Islander labourers were put on ships and taken back to the Pacific Islands. But in 1906, changes were made to allow some to stay, so those who owned land or had been in Australia for more than 20 years or were too old to stay. And lastly, we're going to have a look at the Japanese. Okay, and now this is an interesting one. Japanese people, as well as people from other parts of Malaysia, so definitely Timor and definitely parts of Indonesia and Malaysia, came to Australia to work in the pearl industry. Okay, particularly in Broome, which, if you know Broome at all, was founded pretty much on a really successful pearling industry. They experienced racism due to the fact they looked different to Europeans, and they also had a different culture, which makes them easier to point out. And attempts were made to restrict migration to increase the number of white people working in the industry. Remember, one of the ideas behind the White Australia policy is the idea of, number one, the yellow peril, that we need to be afraid of people from Asia, but number two, that we need to be worried about people from Asia coming in and taking our jobs. They took our jobs! You know the story. The idea was, well, if we restrict the Japanese working in pearling, maybe there'll be more jobs for good white people. But the problem was that it was really hard to actually get white people to work as pearlers because it was dangerous as hell. Okay, so think about it. You're going out every day and you're diving, all right? Although instead of having a scuba tank on your back, most of the time it was a hose that was connected to a pump at the surface that would pump air down to you. Okay, so if any of that stuff breaks, remember this is the late 19th century, early 20th century. If any of that stuff, which isn't as technologically advanced as the scuba gear that we have today, if any of that breaks, you're dead. You're going to drown. You're going to inhale water into your lungs and die. And then couple that with the fact that anyone playing around with shellfish underwater, what likes to eat shellfish? Well, other fish. And what likes to eat other fish? Sharks. So that's another thing that you really got to deal with if you want to work underwater in this capacity. It was really dangerous. So therefore, Japanese pearl divers were more or less exempt from the White Australia policy until the bombing of Broome in World War II. Okay, so you might not really know too much about the bombing of towns in northern Australia, especially Darwin and especially Broome. But more bombs were dropped on Darwin than were on Pearl Harbor. But Broome was also bombed, and of course what happened in a lot of places, including Australia, including America, was that foreign nationals or people from other countries, or especially people who with Japanese heritage, so you might have been born Australian, you might speak English, all that sort of stuff, but if you looked Japanese, you would have been interned, so put in a camp or a prison where you had to stay for the rest of the war because you weren't trusted to not do things for Japan. Alright, so that's the end of the slideshow. Oh yeah, this is a kendo match. So kendo is a Japanese martial art that involves sword fighting, but I think they use wooden swords in Broome in 1915. But yeah, that's the end of the slideshow. Hopefully you've noted some of that down. Remember, you can always go back and play over it again just to refresh your knowledge. Alright, good luck.